Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel DePetris. I'm a fellow at Defense Priorities, a think tank devoted to realism and restraint in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. grand strategy. It is my pleasure to introduce this panel and this event titled Houthi Conundrum, Defend, Degrade, and Defer. And I think the word conundrum is a pretty good term to use at this point because, the United States and the Houthis have been engaging in what is in effect an undeclared armed conflict in the Red Sea since November, with no end in sight. Just last night, the Houthis launched 4 long-range UAVs or drones against U.S. warships in the Red Sea that were shot down. March 2nd, earlier this month, the Houthis actually sunk a large carrier, the Rubamar, which carried tons of fertilizer. And in March 6th, the carrier, the Confidence, another carrier in the Red Sea, was hit by a ballistic missile and actually resulted in casualties. 3 crew members were killed. We're going to speak about all this and more, and it's great to be here moderating this event with 3 esteemed panelists. The first is Michael Domino. He is the public policy manager and fellow at Defense Priorities and my colleague and good friend. He is a former military analyst and counterterrorism officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. And before that, he served as a consultant to the Defense Department, and where he advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff and U.S. European Command on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Mike recently published a policy brief with Defense Priorities titled Weighing Additional U.S. Responses to Houthi Red Sea Attacks, and we'll certainly go into detail in that, Mike. Next, we have Gregory Brew, who's an analyst with the Eurasia Group's Energy, Climate, and Resources team, focusing on the geopolitics of oil and gas. He served as the Eurasia Group's country analyst for Iran. Before coming to Eurasia Group, he was a Kissinger Visiting Fellow at the Jackson School for Global Affairs at Yale University. And he has written 2 books on the history of modern Iran, including Petroleum and Progress in Iran, and Struggle for Iran, Oil Autocracy, and the Cold War. And I should say, that last book was, as a reader, an avid reader myself, that was an extremely informative book, and I appreciated that, and it needed to be said in the discourse. Last but certainly not least, we have Fatima Abu al-Asrar. She's a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Before joining the Institute, Fatima was a senior analyst at the Arabia Foundation in Washington, D.C., and Middle East and North Africa Director for Cure Violence. From 2006 to 2012, she worked as an advisor for the Embassy of Yemen in Washington. And before that, she served as a program officer for the Department for International Development in Yemen. So I want to thank all 3 of you. I can't think of 3 other people who were well acclaimed enough to speak about the Houthis, but you 3 are certainly at the top of the list. So thank you for joining me this morning. I think I wanted to open up the discussion with a very simple but crucial question, and that is, are the Houthis a threat to U.S. interests in the Middle East? We'll go with Mike first, and then Gregory, and then Fatima, and I think we could keep it within 3 to 5 minutes with your opening remarks, if that's possible. Mike, you want to get us started here?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Dan and Gregory and Fatima for this great panel. I'm excited to delve into this topic with you guys. Look, I think, maybe I'll take a bit of a maximalist approach to this question, kind of in the interest of spurring discussion here. But I think my answer is the Houthis present no threat to U.S. interests at all. In fact, if we really take a close look at why the Houthis are doing what they're doing right now, we have to be honest about the other sort of strategic motives and drivers at play here. The Houthis did not just wake up and decide to close down most of the shipping in the Red Sea. If you look at, I believe, by my last count, over a dozen now public statements by Houthi leadership, this is a response to what's going on in Gaza in an effort to, I think, push the group to a sort of a first among equals, if you will, and sort of, responding to what's going on in Gaza on behalf of the Muslim world. And then also, asserting itself, right, as this very fascinating group that, I think is very poorly understood in the West, right? The Houthis are not an ethnic group. They're not really a terrorist group. We may call them that, right? They were designated as an FTO. They were removed from that listing. They were re-added. But they're really more of a pseudo state. And if you're familiar with Yemen's history at this point, and again, whether this is a good development or a bad development, this is just the reality. Right? We had North and South Yemen during the Cold War, separated as a result of colonialism and everything else. And then, now the Houthis control basically what used to be North Yemen, and they really do operate as something of a pseudo state. And depending on your count, you're looking at 100 to 200,000 or more Houthi fighters or Houthi members, right, that could be drawn on to support any kind of operations that they're conducting. And the Houthis have defeated the Saudis in really a decade-long civil war in Yemen, and they have emerged from that conflict, again, whether anybody likes it or not, as sort of the group with the monopoly on violence in North Yemen. And so I think it's important to take a step back and recognize sort of the group for what it is. This is not some tiny little, Al-Qaeda offshoot. This is not, some kind of, small organization that can sort of easily be, swatted away. And I think that grappling with that has been a very, I guess I'd say, new phenomenon for folks at the Pentagon or the State Department to understand that this group is resilient, whether anybody likes it or not. And the U.S. has tried to sort of, respond to the Houthi attacks with, air and naval strikes. We've now seen, I believe, close to 300 of them at this point, if they're added all together. And we really haven't seen any kind of change in Houthi strategic calculus, which I'd point out as well, I would assess is really their own, right? We've had a lot of discourse and discussion over the last several months about Iranian proxy groups and to what extent these groups have strategic autonomy. I think it's pretty clear that the Houthis are doing what they're doing to assert themselves, to increase their wasta, their sort of validity as an organization. And also, I think because they genuinely are trying to respond to what's going on in Gaza. And again, we don't have to agree with those means or those ends, but we have to understand, our adversaries for what they are and for what they say, right? You have to kind of take those statements at least and incorporate them into your analysis, I believe. So the Houthis have conducted these attacks. We've responded with our own, but we haven't really stopped at any point to really assess what the objectives are here for the United States and really what the need is for the United States to be doing a lot of this, right? There's been a lot of discussion over the past several months on really the economic impact here is fairly low for the United States compared to China or Europe. And there are ways that we can go about this that don't necessarily have to involve the use of military force, which I think to this point, it's fair to say hasn't been effective anyway. Looking at opportunities for diplomacy, possibly with Oman as a mediator, looking at the opportunities to, pass some of the buck to our European allies, or frankly, to not validate the Houthis by responding to force with force and looking for other ways to sort of move this issue into a different phase. The Houthis conducted attacks in the Red Sea in 2016 on U.S. ships, and they sort of gave that up as other things became more important to them over the course of the civil war in Yemen. And so again, I think a lot of this is driven by what the group's strategic priorities are. And right now, they're getting a lot of bang for their buck in what they're doing in the Red Sea, whether it's increasing the profile of them in the region and internationally, and also in sort of demonstrating that the U.S. and the West, right, is not able to necessarily ignore some of these regional dynamics at play. So I don't want to take too much more time, but I think all those dynamics are worth discussing today, and I'm excited to hear what Greg and Fatima have to say.
Thank you, Mike. Gregory, you're up.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much for the kind comments about my book. It's on sale now for anyone who's interested. And thanks, Mike, as well for those excellent comments. I think that set up the conversation today really well regarding who the Houthis are, their position sort of relative to the United States. And in response to the question, that Dan posed, what kind of threat do the Houthis pose to U.S. interests? I think it kind of gets at the question of what are U.S. interests broadly, what are they in the Middle East, and what are they in the Red Sea specifically? I think from the point of view of policymakers in DC, and I think from the point of view of quite a lot of the discourse around the Houthi issue, there are sort of three broad areas of interests that are focused on. The first is the U.S. interest in guaranteeing the free flow of commerce and maritime trade. This has been a cornerstone of U.S. Primacy, U.S. strategy, certainly since the end of World War II, since 1945. I think it's sometimes missed that the world has had one naval superpower over the last 70 years, and that's the United States. It's the only nation that maintains a naval presence in every ocean. It's the only nation that takes on this burden, if you like, of guaranteeing the free flow of commerce. So I think from the point of view of policymakers in DC, the Houthis pose an immediate threat to this notion that commerce should be free, that maritime traffic should be unimpeded, and that the United States has a role to play in guaranteeing that flow. So that's the first interest. The second interest is, U.S. military hegemony in the Middle East. Another point that is occasionally missed is that even with the discourse, the conversation around the U.S. drawing down or withdrawing or what have you, the United States is still the region's military hegemon. It's still by far the most powerful military force in the region. And the Houthis are kind of thumbing their nose at that notion by launching these attacks, which the United States has now responded to with military force. But as we've now been emphasizing, this U.S. response has really had no impact on either the Houthis' capability or their will to launch these attacks. So the U.S. notion of maintaining this hegemony, this supremacy in the Middle East is being challenged by the Houthis. So this is the second interest. The third interest, and I'll mention it only briefly, is the ongoing U.S. interest to maintain access to Middle East energy. Anytime there is a crisis in the Middle East, the question of oil and natural gas is inevitably pulled up. And that has been an element of this discourse. Anytime I read reports or see coverage of the Red Sea crisis, there's invariably a mention of how much oil or how much gas is being affected. So again, from the point of view of DC, from the point of view of policymakers and the dominant discourse, these are the main U.S. interests that are being affected by the Houthis. But as I mentioned, it really depends on how you define these interests and how you position them in broader U.S. strategy. And when you take a step back, things start to look a little different. Take this first issue, the Houthis' threat to the free flow of maritime commerce. The United States, even if it maintains this role of maintaining the free flow of commerce, the free flow of traffic, it's not the nation that is most affected by this disruption. It's Europe, China, South Asia that is seeing the greatest impact from the Houthis' campaign, which has diverted almost all container ship traffic, which has diverted a significant number of bulk carriers, and has had a progressively larger impact on the flow of oil, natural gas, and refined products. It's primarily these states that are being affected. So it stands to reason that these are the states that would have the greatest interest in resolving the issue. But of course, as many have been noting, China specifically has had very little role in addressing the Houthi threat. We've seen reports on arrangements between the Houthis and Beijing regarding the safety of Chinese ships. But if the Houthi attacks are anything to go by, Chinese traffic has not been completely secure from Houthi attacks. And beyond that, the Chinese importance, or the importance of China in global trade, is invariably affected by a disruption on this scale. So it's not just the interest of the United States that's being affected here. It's the interest of many states. And I think addressing the Houthis' threat to maritime commerce requires a response from these other states. On the second interest, U.S. military hegemony in the Middle East, this is obviously an issue that many of the folks on this panel are intimately familiar with. Arguing that the Houthis pose a threat to the interest of the United States in maintaining its military position in the Middle East gets to the question as to what the value of that position ultimately is. Does the United States really draw gains from maintaining this position as the Middle East military hegemon? And we can get to that if we want to, but is it really the U.S. role to respond as it has done with military force against the Houthi attacks, or is it perhaps an issue that local states should be addressing. States such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, even the other states of the Red Sea littoral. These are the states that are most immediately threatened by the Houthi military capability. It is not the United States that is most threatened. And finally, a U.S. interest in maintaining the flow of energy affected by the Houthis' attacks. This is an issue that I have written on specifically. The energy impact from the Red Sea disruption affects the United States very little. It's also a disruption that energy markets have largely managed. Flows have moved in different directions. Different markets are being supplied by new sources of oil, natural gas, and refined products, particularly the United States. And also, the Red Sea disruption is not affecting all traffic. A considerable number of Russian and Middle East tankers, product tankers, are still moving through the Red Sea. So it has not disrupted the flow of energy in totality. So just to conclude very quickly, I mean, how we define the Houthis' impact on US interests ultimately depends on how we define those interests and how we position them in the larger context of US strategy in the Middle East and in the Red Sea in particular.
Thank you, Gregory. Fatima, you're up. Please bring us home here.
Thanks, Dan, Mike, and Gregory. And thanks for Defense Priorities for having me. It's a complex situation for sure, but I think it's very important to first and foremost highlight that the Houthis never really hid their intentions. We are where we are today at the Red Sea. It's because they told us that this is what they were planning on all along. So from the very start of the conflict, the Houthis have seen the United States as an enemy. Not, mind you, not Saudi Arabia, not anyone else. They did speak about that, but it is ingrained in their thought process and their ideology that the US is the ultimate enemy, and they've been working up gradually towards destabilizing the US interests in the region. So, and part of, again, why we are here and why we have to respond to them is because we've underestimated that capability that they have, to the extent that we're actually not even entirely sure that what we're doing right now with them is effective. Speaking about maybe the origins of this group and also like some of the conversations that I have with multiple Yemeni groups in Yemen and in Washington and elsewhere and in the diaspora for sure. People ask me to emphasize a very important point is that the Houthis do not represent Yemeni people, and I think it's extremely important to make that distinction. They are not a majority up in the north, but they're holding the north hostage through their actions and through their violence. And they're primarily seen as terrorists in Yemen before they're seen as so in the United States. In fact, if there's any objection to the designation that they have, it's because not only does it come too late, but because it only is seen from a U.S. interest and in a U.S. standpoint, whereby because of their threat on the Red Sea and on Israel, that they are considered as such, whereby the Yemeni people see them as such because of the devastating impact that they've had on Yemeni people. Ultimately, the actions the United States decides to take, and especially without any coordination with Yemeni local actors, does not bode well for the stability of the country or for the stability of the region. There are different conversations that are going on at this moment between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that are completely disconnected from what's happening right now. And primarily, the Houthis are a regional threat. They're a threat to their own people. They're a threat to Saudi Arabia, to UAE, and it might seem to be less of a threat to the United States. But again, they've been working gradually to reach where they are. And the most concerning part for Yemenis who are watching the US airstrikes on the Houthis is that yes, the Houthis have somewhat baited the United States in intervening. It's really stalking, like it's preparing for a war, or entangling the United States for a war, and that's pretty much allowing them to recruit more on the ground, to enforce enlisting of any capable Yemeni person now to defend the nation from an American and Israeli threat. And they've been recruiting in the past based on that thinking, and now all what they're saying is that finally America is showing its true intention and it's striking us, and that is extremely dangerous because it ends up empowering the Houthis, and definitely the United States doesn't necessarily care to intervene or care to reform the Houthis. So it's something that the Yemeni people will have to deal with. And from that perspective, and as Gregory was talking about the U.S. hegemony in the region, it really puts Yemenis in a bad situation, and it could somewhat deepen the conflict. But from a wider perspective, and if we really step out from all of this, and if we think about like the war that Yemen has been embroiled with for the past 9 years, the Houthis have been working towards a larger objective, which is having the sole autonomy and having uncontested power over the north of Yemen, and really just conducting attacks to deepen or basically to widen their expansion in Yemen, and to give Iran and the Islamic Republic the leverage that it wants in Yemen. The broader picture is economic disruption. President Rouhani back in 2018 made it clear that on the back of the refusal of the Iranian deal, that if they are not going to be able to export oil to other countries, then no one else in the region should. So the idea back from 2018 and even before till now is that if they can find ways to disrupt the economy through the utilization of the Red Sea, then that would be extremely beneficial for them, and that would give them leverage. And what the Houthis have found right now is the perfect excuse. And both the Houthis and the Islamic Republic are masters in propaganda warfare, and the Houthis have, even among their adversaries at the moment, have found enough voices and sympathy towards their actions in the Red Sea, where many people in the region are seeing it as legitimate, and this is extremely dangerous. So, in a sense, with the U.S. responding, and we know this from, again, 9 years of war, is that the Houthis' capabilities have only been growing. They haven't been restrained, and I think part of it is because the focus was in the wrong direction. We never really were able to understand, and there isn't really a good track record for the United States in terms of disarming non-state actors. No record of that being done quickly. So it's something that needs a long-term strategy that the U.S. hasn't really come up with, and it's also very, very important. It's fundamental to emphasize that the U.S. has spearheaded a lot of efforts and has given and acted in good faith with the Houthi militia by exhausting all of its diplomatic channels. The President Biden had the good intentions at the beginning of his term when he wanted to see an end to Yemen's war, but the more time that he spent, and with the appointment of the U.S. envoy, the clearer it became that the Houthis were not acting in good faith. That they have been really reneging on negotiation processes and stringing everybody along in the process while expanding on the ground and getting all the support and weapons and training from Hezbollah in Iran. So in this context, the international community, the U.S., its allies, they do face a significant challenge in dealing with the Houthis and in securing the Red Sea lanes. But and of course, the issue, there's a lot of complexity surrounding military engagement in the region. But what's really important is to have a strategic approach that would deal with the Houthis, and something that would be done in coordination with a legitimate entity, civil society organizations, with Yemenis who really want to dislodge the Houthis but are unable to do so. The final thing I would like to say is that Yemenis have long described the Houthis as a militia that is somewhat pampered by the international community. And I think there is this dangerous misconception that the United States is actually empowering the Houthis by not responding to them, because throughout the 9 years of war, there has been just a lot of voices that asked for constraint in Yemen, but have done really nothing to dislodge the Houthis from where they are, or to ensure that there is a political process in place. In fact, what happened is the opposite, is ensuring that the Houthis have somewhat, had all the guarantees necessary for them to accept peace agreements, and ultimately they reneged on them. So the Yemenis do, a lot of them, a majority of them, feel that it's in the best interest of the United States to empower the Houthis so that Yemen remains a failed state. The recent airstrikes challenge that perception, but they also come way too late, because it's no longer about the security of Yemen in the region. It's just about the security of the Red Sea and Israel.
Yeah. Thank you, Fatima. Greg, you had a really interesting piece, I believe it was last month, in War on the Rocks, sort of talking about how the military operations in the Red Sea and sort of the tit-for-tat in that area. It's not as bad in terms of, it's impacting supply chains. We know that, right? But I guess the question is it impacting prices on oil and gas? And it seems to me, looking back, just using the Brent benchmark over the last 6 months, oil prices have been relatively stable, I think, over the last 6 months. And to the extent it's been high, it's been maybe mid 80s per barrel, which, we've had it at $140 dollars a barrel. We've had it at $160 a barrel before. So I guess my question is, why is the market adapting so well to these operations in the area? Is it because the Red Sea isn't necessarily a prime choke point for oil, or something else entirely?
Sure. So I think the Red Sea, any disruption is going to have an impact on price, at least for a limited time, because tankers, whether they're oil tankers, whether they're LNG tankers, or whether they're carrying refined products. And it is important to sort of make that distinction, because it does have different disruptive effects. Any disruption is going to have an impact on price for at least a little while, because everyone then needs to, redirect and divert and figure out new price points, new effects on costs. And there has been an impact. But the thing about it is that it's sort of two reasons. The first is that the Red Sea itself, while a main conduit for supplies running east to west from the Middle East to major consumer markets in the Atlantic, also from west to east now. Now one of the largest channels of energy moving through the Red Sea is coming from Russia to South Asia, which is quite remarkable, and is largely a result of the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia that have forced it to look for new markets for its products. So the Red Sea is important, but it's not on the same level as, say, the Strait of Hormuz, which obviously is the major choke point for all Persian Gulf energy, whether it's oil or natural gas. It's a choke point that can't be avoided. You can't divert around the Strait of Hormuz. You have to go through it, or you're not going anywhere at all. So a major disruption to the Strait of Hormuz would have enormously destabilizing effects. But the Red Sea crisis hasn't been as destabilizing, and there are really two reasons for that. The first is that the market has changed. in the last 10 years, largely for two reasons. The first I mentioned, Russia is no longer supplying Europe with oil and other energy products. Now most of it is going to India, South Asia, and East Asia. Russia is not a target for Houthi attacks. The Houthis, I am often at pains to point this out. The Houthis are not embargoing shipping through the Red Sea. They're being relatively discriminating in who they're targeting. And the Russians aren't really on their hit list. They do occasionally hit Russian ships. It's not always clear if they do so on purpose. But the Russians have felt safe moving their energy through, as have most Middle East producers. The other major reason is that the United States is now arguably the most important supplier of energy in the North Atlantic. The United States is now sending an enormous amount of crude, refined products, and of course LNG to markets in Europe. So the disruptive impact for Europe, which is one of the largest near markets to the Red Sea, hasn't been that significant. So as far as energy goes, the Red Sea disruption has been fairly manageable. But I think it is important to take a step back and to say that, very often energy dominates these kinds of discussions, but it's largely a container ship story. Container ships started diverting almost immediately as a result of the Red Sea disruption. And that has had an impact. I mean, it's tough to parse out because you have to look at different supply chains, you have to look at different markets. But container shipping having to take an additional 2 weeks to get around Africa did have an impact. Again, largely to Europe. But the thing now is that given that you've had 4 months of this crisis playing out, the impact has now largely been absorbed. The costs have largely been shouldered, and most markets have moved on. And there you do have a case of lessons being learned, because this is the third major supply chain disruption that we've had in the last 4 years. The first was COVID. The second was Russia-Ukraine. So by the time we get to the Red Sea disruption, shippers, supply chain outfits, logisticians, and consumers have actually gotten fairly good at managing disruptive events like this. So that has helped mitigate the overall impact. But, the impact has been there. I would conclude by saying, the price of oil is affected by all kinds of different things. And the fact that it was so stable for the sort of 3 months, the first 3 months of the Red Sea disruption, was quite remarkable. It's now changing. It's ticking up a little bit, and that's mostly on the back of other factors. But as far as the oil story goes, the Red Sea disruption has sort of played out at this point.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think we have a tendency to kind of assume that, if something happens in a flashpoint, oil is going to go through the roof. And I think there's just a prevailing assumption, the conventional wisdom that that's going to be the case, when in reality, markets are pretty adaptable and they manage crises quite well, depending on the circumstances. But so thank you, Gregory. Mike, I wanted to switch to the military aspects of the Houthis. You talked a bit about this in your policy brief for us. What do they have militarily? We know they have UAVs. We know they have attack drones. We know they have cruise missiles, ballistic missiles of various ranges. Do we have any idea about the numbers, their capacity to manufacture these things? Where do they get them? Please educate us here on all of those if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a number of points to make here. One, overall, sort of the broad-based military analysis here is really that the indigenous production capabilities for the Houthis to make a lot of these ASBMs, ASCMs, surface-to-air missiles, fairly minimal, right? So they are working with pretty robust logistics networks that they've developed with smugglers, with the Iranians, right, with the IRGC to get a lot of this technology. We've seen a couple of these small dhows, these small boats that have been intercepted by the U.S. Navy several times now that show really a lot of how the process works here, where you'll have, missile components that are sort of, itemized, separated, and shipped out, and then the Houthis will do the assembling kind of on their end, right? And so there is some technical capability there, but it's not, it's not as robust maybe as a full-blown state actor. As far as overall numbers, again, without getting into classified numbers, there was a DIA assessment from a few years ago that was declassified that I believe had the entire missile arsenal, right, which includes, surface-to-air missiles, as well as, the ASBMs and the stuff they're using to attack ships, in the high hundreds to thousands, right, as far as the overall capability set here. And I think it's important to note some of the recent history as well. The Houthis only expanded their missile capabilities and only improved their missile capabilities in the middle of a decade-long bombing campaign by the Saudis. So they have demonstrated what we call very strong denial and deception, D&D capabilities, where the Houthis have been able to use decoys, physical concealment, hiding things underground, as well as some more impressive technical capabilities like false emitters, where the Houthis were able to basically make something look like a radar or make something look like missile emplacement when it isn't. And I just have to say, if you've been on the other side of these things as a practitioner or a targeter or whatever, even the United States can be fooled by these things, right? I think a lot of people have this notion that the U.S. military is very technically sophisticated, and we are, and I'm not doubting that. But some of these basic denial and deception capabilities work very, very, very well. And the Saudis saw that firsthand. The Saudis also used precision-guided munitions, the same precision-guided munitions that we're seeing in Ukraine right now, Dan. Storm Shadows and JDAMs and paveways and all the same sophisticated equipment that any kind of Western military would use. The Saudis had Western intelligence support. They were flying modern aircraft. And so, we have some historical precedent here when we're saying, well, why hasn't the U.S. been successful in degrading these arsenals? Sure, you could argue the Saudi Air Force, Saudi pilots maybe aren't as good as American pilots, but at the end of the day, the capability set that was brought to bear against the Houthis is basically the same as what you're seeing from a carrier battle group and F-18s, dropping JDAMs and using HARMs, anti-radiation missiles that target radars and stuff like that. It's the same stuff. And it hasn't been any more successful than the Saudis have been. So again, I think that it's important to sort of talk about that history, because the Houthis have demonstrated, again, to Fatima's earlier point, whether they're representative of the Yemeni people or not, or whether this is a good development, they do have a monopoly on violence in North Yemen, and they do have control. And they've been able to maintain that control via some of these tactics that have been very successful in blunting the capability of, especially of an air campaign. And we've talked about this before, Dan, as well. We had Kelly Greiko from the Stimson Center, who's fantastic, on one of these live streams before, and she made a very interesting point on the scholarship, the literature on air campaigns intended as punishment rather than to deny your opponent their objectives. And those kinds of air campaigns that are really only punishment, or I guess you could call them therapeutic for the United States, or to make it look like we're doing something or feel like we're doing something, they don't have a very strong track record of success. And what we're seeing is that we're not really denying the Houthis any of their strategic objectives in conducting these strikes. And in some ways, to points that Fatima and Greg and others have brought up here, in some ways, the Houthis sort of look better maybe than they are, or more capable than they are, by the fact that the U.S. is doing this and not really achieving anything. So the capabilities are fairly strong. That's why I say that the Houthis are more similar to a pseudo-state. Again, not as an endorsement, but if you're talking about military capabilities, they're not, some kind of podunk, terrorist group with 100 members and some AKs. I mean, you're talking about some fairly sophisticated capabilities that they're able to use relationships with Iran, with other, actors in the region, other groups in the region to their advantage. So I think when we're talking about the capabilities, I would say that the U.S. really underestimated them, and then also overestimated its ability to degrade these capabilities over time. And again, I would point to the Saudi air campaign that we all saw over the last decade as sort of the proof positive that can't really work as a strategy.
Yeah. Fatima, in terms of that Iran Houthi connection, we hear a lot about, the Iranians are essentially using the Houthis for their own purposes, to harass shipping and just cause kind of destabilization in the Red Sea because it's in their interest. That's one of the conventional viewpoints out there. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about their their relationship? When have the Iranians kind of been interested in the Houthis, not necessarily as a proxy, but maybe as a partner in Yemen, and to the extent of the relationship growing to become more of a strategic partnership. Do they have control over the Houthis? They don't have command and control, correct? They have a little bit of influence, considering that they do arm the Houthis to some extent. So what is your take on the overall relationship between those two actors?
You see, I think we've been too focused on sort of like thinking about whether Iranians are commanding the Houthis and telling them what to do. And I don't think that's like the right thing to think about. It's rather that both of them have strategic objectives. The Houthis are using Iran in the same way that Iran is using the Houthis. So there's a mutual relationship and alliance, but where it is a point of concern is that the Houthis are not acting in their self-interest at the moment. And that's quite evident, and they haven't been acting in their self-interest for a very long time by implementing what seems to be an IRGC agenda, because it's the IRGC that wants to have leverage. The Houthis have gotten their demands met multiple times through multiple peace processes. They have been brought to the negotiation table and been offered peace. They've been offered a process where they can share power, and they've rejected that. And this rejection is because of, I mean, verbally they say they'd like to share power, but they kept on raising their seal of demands. It's basically because it's in the best interest of the Islamic Republic of Iran to have them there as principal agitators. If you look right now at the region, no other actor is taking the same bold, brazen actions as the Houthi. No other non-state actor is. Hezbollah is restraining itself. Other groups are somewhat restraining themselves, but the Houthis are happy to give themselves up to this wider cause. I'd like to mention that at the very beginning of the conflict, the Houthis denied the relationship with Iran, and Iran denied it too. And as a result, for some reason, the international actors and media went along with that. So even to say something like the Iran-backed Houthi was not in the language of many of the newspapers or in journals or in academia. That was not the case. In fact, people, said that beyond very minimal support and capability, that there's no relationship between both of them, which was at stark contrast to, what Yemeni people saw. Yemeni people did see IRGC officers on the ground training Yemenis and training the Houthis specifically. The relationship is long. It's an ideological one. It's a spiritual one. And it's more focused on, the Houthis have definitely a legitimate grievance. They've been sidelined from power. They've been ignored, or at least, holders of their faith, of their Zaydi sect faith, have been marginalized historically. There's the Zaydism, who are somewhat aligned with Shia. They're kind of seen in the middle between Shia and Sunni. Zaydis held the upper echelons of Yemen, and they've held power for almost 1,000 years. So, the Houthis were part of that, and after the Yemen revolution, they fell the farthest. All of the benefits and the privileges that they've had were no longer there. But during the Arab Spring, the youth, there was momentum to integrate them and to have them in power and to give them a voice. And unfortunately, they've exploited that to the benefit of their financiers. They were more interested in violence, in military more so than a diplomatic or a political process. And they wanted to see themselves as, again, put themselves as upholders of faith and institute language that is completely um, um, it's nothing that Yemeni people believe in. You know, their violent slogan, "Death to America, death to Israel," and more on the Jews is instilling a really violent language and ideology in the mindset of millions of Yemeni people and youth at the moment. So, and this is of concern. Yemen, you know, Yemen may not be of concern to the U.S. right now, because the Houthis seem far away and seem to be just a regional threat more so than a threat to the US. But in time, and my concern as someone who's Yemeni American is that what if this threat grows beyond? I mean, if we can't, if we're having a hard time at the moment dealing with, you know, the very limited but problematic capabilities that the Houthis have without an appropriate defense strategy, I can't even imagine what will happen down the road when they decide, or if they decide to become a significant threat, or if they do an attack on the U.S. I don't want to see Yemen become another Gaza because of our lack of action or the lack of perception in dealing with the threat, and honestly inability to deal with non-state actors and the threat of non-state actors. That's something that is of challenge. It's you know, it's very clear that the Houthis can target ships, infrastructure, and areas that are vital for global trade and energy supplies, but you know, the way that the U.S. responded is also at a mismatch. They have very cheaply made weapons and drones, and you know, the U.S. responds directly in a way that is, you know, could or could not be efficient. And I think to the point that Mike has said earlier is that ultimately the US maybe wants to appear static, that it can deal with a threat when it appears, but I think the lack of strategy in doing so, and the inability to really with confidence say that, you know, you're able to degrade these capabilities is problematic. And there should be more of a strategic and coordinated response. But to leave the Houthis grow, the Houthis will continue to grow. The final thing I want to say is that, you know, like speaking about your question initially was about the Houthis and their relationship with Iran. And speaking to that, you know, the Houthis see themselves as a fundamental part and member of the axis of resistance. They are, you know, their attacks on the ships in the Red Sea, it's mostly to basically support their brethren in Hamas more so than the Palestinian people. Just last week, Houthis have had a massacre in Rada where they've demolished 2 homes and killed many civilians, over 30 women and children. And this is just to settle political grievances, and this is the way that they deal with their opponents. They have no respect for lives, for Yemeni life, and I very much doubt that they have respect for Palestinian life. But at the moment, they're really acting to support Hamas in Gaza and not necessarily the people of Gaza.
Gregory, on Fatima's point about a lack of a U.S. strategy, you know, the administration so far has essentially, to the extent I see a strategy, and a strategy may be too generous of a word at this point. You know, it's precision strikes, right, to degrade certain Houthi capabilities along the coastline, and on occasion inland in inland Yemen. Sanctions. We've had plenty of sanctions on Houthi individuals, and you know, carve outs both inside Yemen and outside Yemen in the Middle Eastern region, trying to degrade their finances. But diplomacy seems to be missing in this picture, and to the extent diplomacy is missing, is it time for the United States to sort of take a more proactive approach in that field? Is it even possible? Would the Houthis be willing to talk to the United States, either directly or indirectly? Give us a sense of what a better strategy would look like, in your opinion.
Sure. So I think I would agree first that strategy is lacking. I think there are important reasons for that. It's not that the United States is making it up as it goes along. It is operating within certain constraints. Those constraints are, not only the creation of the situation in Yemen, where the Houthis, are in, I think what the United States recognizes as a pretty strong position. We forget, things move so quickly, you kind of forget that the initial US reaction to the Houthi attacks was pretty restrained. We're going to shoot down projectiles. We're going to maintain a defensive screen. We're going to safeguard shipping. There was a very clear US reluctance to make this a kinetic campaign, because I think there was an admittance early on that a kinetic campaign against the Houthis wasn't going to accomplish a whole lot. It was also, it's been foremost in the administration's mind to avoid increased kinetic action with Iran. There was a continued concern that bombing the Houthis was going to escalate things with Iran in the context of the broader Middle East crisis. I think the U.S. response to the continued Houthi attacks was, or has been, driven, if not entirely, then largely by political concerns, particularly concerns surrounding the administration's appearance, right? Standing by and allowing the Houthis to continue attacks without responding with kinetic action carried a political cost for Biden, particularly in the context of the general U.S. Problem with resolving the situation in Gaza. So I think, getting back to your question about where does diplomacy fit in, I think there has been diplomacy, albeit limited diplomacy. And it has come in two directions. The first was directed towards China. The U.S. push to China was to try to get Beijing to become more involved, again, in an incident, in a disruptive episode that affects China, arguably to a greater extent than it affects the United States, at least in terms of the economics, to try to get China to step in and apply a little bit of pressure on Iran, specifically, given the closer Chinese relationship with Tehran. That was one diplomatic avenue. It doesn't seem to have resulted in much action, since the Chinese still haven't become very involved in the Red Sea situation. The second diplomatic avenue was towards Iran. As was reported, I think last week or the week before, there was a new round of indirect talks between the United States and Iran in Oman in January, and it was focused primarily on the Houthis, trying to get Iran to apply a little bit of pressure on the Houthis. The Iranians, of course, as Fatima explained, the Iranians have this rhetorical or strategic approach to their proxies or allies in the resistance front, where they don't acknowledge any kind of influence, where they don't acknowledge any kind of leverage. They say, oh, the Houthis are doing what they're doing because they want to. We don't have any control over them. But the United States did see, or has seen, at least a certain avenue for applying pressure on Iran to try to get them to rein in the Houthis. The problem there, of course, is that there's not a tremendous amount of pressure that the United States can exert on Iran at this point, given how limited, given how much U.S.-Iranian relations have degraded since the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. There's not a tremendous amount of leverage that the United States has over Iran to get them to do something like this. And then finally, I would circle back to the issue that looms over all of this, and that's Gaza. The most important diplomatic avenue that the United States has to, if not end the Houthi attacks, then to at least try to rein them in, is to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. And I think that is part of the increased U.S. pressure on Israel over the last, say, 6 or 7 weeks to try to get them to a deal with Hamas that brings about a ceasefire in Gaza, because that is probably the most immediate way that the United States can improve the situation in the Red Sea. I think there needs to be diplomacy. I think there needs to be a coordinated strategy that brings in both the United States and regional partners, and particularly partners in Yemen, as Fatima has so eloquently described. This has to be a situation, this has to be a solution that draws in the agencies and the interests and the needs and desires of the Yemeni people. But before that is possible, there has to be a ceasefire in Gaza.
Thank you, thank you. We're coming close to time. We have about 5 minutes, so I wanted to kind of end on a policymaker's note. Pretend like you're in the Oval Office right now. Okay, you're advising President Biden on what is clearly, like I said in the opening remarks, a conundrum. There doesn't seem to be any end in sight to this situation. We've had 3 or 4 months of U.S. strikes against Houthi positions, and the Houthis have responded with UAVs and ballistic missiles against vessels, commercial and military, including in the U.S. against U.S. Navy vessels in the Red Sea. So, what are 2 or 3 items that you would recommend the administration do that it's currently not doing? Why don't we go to Fatima first, and then Greg, and then Mike, you can close this out. Fatima, you're muted.
I muted myself. I apologize. I'm really thankful for the last point that Greg has mentioned in terms of the ceasefire in Gaza. I think that is fundamental, and I think that's a starting point. And I will add something that is not really connected to this point at all, and I think it should be evaluated on its own merit. Once that ceasefire happens, if it happens, it's not, the Houthis will turn their weapons inwards on Yemeni. They will take all of this campaign and mobilization campaigns that they've had to expand, and we've seen that during the Stockholm Agreement when Hodeidah port was somewhat surrendered to them, or just left in their. There was a battle for Hodeidah, to take Hodeidah back in order to stop the kind of attacks that we're seeing today, and to secure the city. But once that battle stopped, Houthis turned their weapons inwards and expanded. And I think it's really fundamental to, keep, when conducting a strategy elsewhere in the region, to understand what the consequence would be on the local population, which is something that has been absent from multiple administrations. So, the idea here is to really delve deeper into protecting people rather than also just protecting U.S. interests, and understanding what that consequence could be, because it could ultimately end up harming us on the long run.
Thank you. Gregory?
Well, first of all, I would tell the president that this isn't a problem that's going to go away with the ceasefire in Gaza. That the Houthis are there, that they've demonstrated a capability to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, and that this is a long-term problem. Even if the attacks come to a halt, I think Fatima made an excellent point, which is that the Houthis are going to continue to use their weapons, and they may very well create a new pretext to continue attacking Red Sea shipping. So the problem requires a solution. And that solution needs to draw in regional states, but it also needs to draw in major stakeholders in international commerce. I think if the Chinese or if the Europeans played a more active role, along with regional states, in maintaining the security of the Red Sea, there might be slightly more reticence from the Houthis and from their Iranian supporters to continue these kinds of attacks. And finally, I would mention that this has to become a more important aspect of U.S. diplomacy with Iran. The Iranians have demonstrated the ability to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea through their Houthi allies. And I think the current U.S. interest in trying to get the Iranians to rein in the Houthis has to be a continued element of diplomacy with Iran, along with the nuclear program and along with the other important aspects of diplomacy with Tehran that the United States has to continue to focus on. But this is not a problem that will go away with a ceasefire in Gaza. It's one that is going to endure and is going to require a more long-term multilateral solution.
Thank you, Gregory. Mike?
Yeah, I think, the conversation sort of in the last few minutes has really sort of shifted to this bigger issue, which is not really about the Red Sea or what the U.S. is doing right now, or policy recommendations on, sort of the tactical side. It's really about, okay, the Houthis are not going away anytime soon. They may be, a very brutal group like Fatima has outlined. But again, we have to be, honest about the limits of U.S. power to change some of those things. And, the idea that, potentially the United States should go in and and remove the Houthis or other things like that is, I would argue, not in U.S. interests and would only cause more suffering and harm in the long run. And I don't think our track record in Libya or Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan really underscores that that would be advisable. And it's not really that anyone has advocated that here. I think the bigger point, though, is, when we consider policy solutions, they have to involve NGOs, they have to involve humanitarian efforts, they have to involve other actors, other major powers, like Greg outlined, whether it be the Europeans, whether it even be our adversaries like China or other actors. So again, I would say there's a difficult problem here where the Houthis are not going away. They may not have a direct impact on many U.S. interests at the moment. That could change over time, as Fatima and others have outlined. But again, the bigger question there then is, does the U.S. need to go in militarily and try to change the situation on the ground? And I would argue that that's not really the right way to go. But again, it really involves an acknowledgement that whether we like the fact that the Houthis are around or not, they're not going anywhere. And we're going to have to use regional actors, and we're going to have to use non-state actors, other groups, NGOs, to try to solve the humanitarian issues there and to solve some of the political issues there and create a more politically inclusive environment in Yemen. But again, I think the lesson I just want to leave on is we've seen the limits of U.S. military force in solving just the issue, and the idea that more military force or a different in kind military force, some kind of invasion or boots on the ground, which some people have argued. There's not a piece I just saw a couple of days ago, actually, I think from Keith Kellogg, outlining some of those points. And again, I would just say that as tempting as that may be, I think we know at this point how fraught and frankly counterproductive that sort of approach would be as well.
Michael Domino, Gregory Brew, Fatima Abu Al-Asrar, thank you so much for all three of you for coming on here. It was a very interesting conversation and certainly enlightening to me. And I appreciate everybody who tuned in. And please be sure to check this space. Defense Priorities has live stream events quite frequently. So we hope to see you again. Thank you.